Hey guys, it's been a little while, hasn't it? Yeah, I really haven't made one of these high-effort videos in some time. I've been dealing with a lot of real-life stuff that hasn't been the most fun, and it's been keeping me from working on bigger videos like this. But it hasn't been all bad. On the plus side, I got a new PC, and I've started working on a webcomic. And since I'm making said comic, I decided I'd make a little video to show you guys how I go about doing it. Making comics is the most fun, rewarding, and accessible things an artist can do. It's also incredibly boring and tedious, but what form of art isn't? It's also a lot harder when you don't know where to start. So I decided to throw together this comprehensive guide on how I make comics, with tips on how you can make your own. By the way, the video behind me is depicting my process for a page of my webcomic, Obsidian Blaze, which you can read using links in the description. Anyway, let's get into it. First thing you'll need is a story. If you're watching this video, I assume you already have one. If not, there's a lot of ways to come up with one. A lot of people make storyos by drawing from real life, be it your own personal life or just in general. And believe me, there have been a lot of events from the past few years that would be great inspiration for a story. I also like to repurpose old ideas of my own. For example, I'm a big fan of the band Gorillaz, so I wanted to come up with my own virtual band following the same idea. But then I realized I have no musical talent and I doubted any of my musician friends would be interested, so I scrapped it. But one of the members of the band was a really appealing character to me, so I repurposed her into the character Beat in my comic. You can also repurpose other people's ideas. Now, don't take this the wrong way. Stealing ideas and plagiarism is not only bad, it's illegal, but it can work sometimes. Let's take an example from the popular indie comic The Boys, or the Amazon Prime show based on it. The character Homelander is clearly a stand-in for Superman. He can fly, shoot lasers, he's indestructible, he's Superman, obviously. But he's different enough from Superman that they can get away with it. First of all, his name isn't Superman. Second, he's, well, evil. He's very clearly meant to represent an evil version of Superman, without claiming to be Superman. So following this example, if you've always wanted to write a Batman story, nothing's stopping you from using that same story, but with an original superhero based on Batman. Now this example doesn't always work. Let's take a look at a comic called Diesel. It only ran for one issue, and you're about to see why. It's about these characters who can summon spirits that fight for them called stands. Wait a second, this is just Jojo. Yep, as you can see, this comic is almost word for word a ripoff of the Induel fight from Jojo Stardust Crusaders. Now the main character doesn't look much like Jotaro, and his stand doesn't look like Star Platinum either, but it's still very obvious where the inspiration came from. I'm getting off topic. Bottom line, taking inspiration from pre-existing media is perfectly fine, but be careful you're not ripping anything off. Once you got your story, figure out the basic structure for where you want it to go. Don't try to figure out everything at once, but have a general trajectory. I fell into this trap a few years ago with an old webcomic of mine. I got so into the story that I just didn't want to draw the comic. I had an entire list of about 40 chapters before I'd even finished one. So yeah, don't write an entire novel before you start your comic, and don't plan too far ahead. It'll only discourage you from actually making the comic. It's good practice to jot down ideas for future story events, and then work towards them gradually. Plus, remember that you're not locked down into your story. If you come up with another idea when you're writing, do that instead. Okay, now that you got your story planned out, time to write your script. This is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't get too into it. I will give one tip I know a lot of younger people don't do. Most importantly, remember to proofread, over and over and over again. This isn't going to be your finished product, so you'll have free rein to go back and change stuff until you actually write your comic. Again, don't lock yourself in. Even when drawing your comic, feel free to go off script if need be. This is different if somebody else is writing a comic, but if you're writing and drawing, go for it. Next, my favorite part, drawing the comic. First, you'll need an art medium, of course. By this, I mean you'll need to decide how you want to draw. Are you going to go traditional, digital, use a tablet, make it black and white? Personally, I use an app called Procreate, which is made specifically for use on the iPad Pro. There's a lot of tools that make drawing easier, and while it isn't perfect, it's one of the best drawing programs I've used myself. I've also done art and comics traditionally, but I find this takes a lot longer. In the end, it's totally up to you. Now, before you draw your first page, it's best to have a layout template. This is especially useful if you plan on printing your comic. The standard comic book is drawn on 11 by 17 inch paper, with the margins a little less than an inch inward. This gives plenty of room for page borders and margins, so your drawing doesn't get cut off during printing. If you're drawing traditionally, I recommend buying some sketch paper with the margins pre-printed on them. Otherwise, if you're drawing it digitally, you can just download some online. You could also make your own either way. we're still not ready to draw just yet. First, we need to sketch the thumbnails. Basically, this is the rough layout for how your comic will look. Basic panel structure, character placement, speech bubbles, etc. You don't need to get too detailed here. In fact, you barely need to be detailed at all. Just include enough detail that you know what's going on. This is especially important if you're doing it traditionally. Digital art gives you a lot of freedom to change things around, but traditional art doesn't have that luxury. So planning things out before you put your pen to paper can save a lot of headaches in the future. Oh, and speaking of speech bubbles, I have some advice for that too. If your character is going to say a lot of dialogue at once, be sure to spread the dialogue over multiple speech bubbles and even multiple panels instead of all cramming it into one. This will make your comic much more interesting to read. We'll talk about this more when I get into a negative example of how not to make comics. Oh boy, I'm not looking forward to that. Finally, we can start drawing our page. For me, this includes 4 basic steps. Step 1, sketch, or pencils. This is probably my favorite step because you have complete freedom. This ultimately decides what your comic will look like. I like to be nice and loose with my sketches. Relax, go with the flow here. You can always clean it up in the next step. Which brings us to step 2, line art, or inks. This one you have to be a little bit more vigilant. If you're doing your comic traditionally, you're going to have to trace over your pencils with ink. For this, I recommend using Lightbox, since it'll make it easier to trace onto another piece of paper. Digitally, you can just do it on another layer. This is probably my least favorite step. It's definitely the one that takes the longest for me. This is also the best time to add your dialogue and speech bubbles. Lettering can be pretty tedious in traditional art, so even if you are doing your comic traditionally, I recommend doing the text digitally, unless you have a really good handwriting. Anyway, on to step 3, colors. This is when the comic really comes to life. Obviously, if you're doing your comic in black and white, you can skip this step. If you're doing your comic traditionally, I would recommend doing this step on a copy of your art rather than the original. That way, if you mess up, you can start over without having to repeat step 2. Personally, I prefer to color digitally, even when the comic itself is drawn traditionally. Next, the final step, rendering. This is where you'll add shading, effects, that kind of thing. My personal advice for this? Don't render every panel. I almost never put shading in my comics. Comics take a lot of hard work, so you want to take every opportunity you can to be lazy. I'm not saying don't shade or render your comic ever, but save your skills for when you really need them. Pulling another example, let's take a look at the comic Amulet. The art in this comic is absolutely amazing. In the smaller panels, you can see the author puts in just enough rendering. Not every panel has to look amazing, but then for landscapes, establishing shots, or other important moments, he puts in these amazing, sometimes 2-page wide painting with insane detail and rendering. But not every panel has to look this amazing, so he only pulls it out when he needs to. Not only would this trick save you time, but it'll also make your big moments seem even bigger. Okay, now you've got a finished page. What now? Well, you've got to publish it, of course. There's a lot of ways to do this, and I don't know all of them, but here's a few. If you're planning on publishing online, the easiest route would be to make a social media account, like on Twitter or Tumblr. Tumblr is especially good for comics. Specialized webcomic publishing sites like Tapas and Webtoon are good too, but they require you to shrink your pages to a smaller file size in order to upload them. Personally, I use a website called Comic Fury, which basically allows you to create and customize your own website for your comic for free. If you plan on printing your comic, there's a lot of ways to do it. You can print at home, but the quality may not be as good and it'll definitely be more expensive in the longer run. There are also plenty of online print-on-demand sites like Lulu or even Amazon, but my advice would be to go to your local print shop. They're usually pretty inexpensive depending on how many copies you want to print. I'd also recommend publishing online before you publish a print version, if you're starting off smaller. Okay, so now that I've explained how to make a comic, the video must be over now, right? No. I've talked about everything that makes a good comic, but something I've learned about art is that it's one thing to learn how to do something, but it's a whole other thing to learn how not to do something. So, let's briefly take a look at one of the worst comics in existence, Sonichu. I've always found Sonichu fascinating for a number of reasons. One of which is the creator, who I won't be talking about right now. But another is because it does everything wrong. If you take all the fundamentals of comic book creation I just said and look at Sonichu from each point, it does literally all of them wrong. It's baffling. Let's take a look at the story first. The story is literally just the worlds of Sonic and Pokemon mashed together. That's plagiarism on 2 fronts. Eventually, the story changes into a strange amalgam of anime plot points and the author's own twisted view on her own life, but ignoring that, the story is just all over the place, and the author doesn't actually plan anything. Basically, whatever idea she comes up with, she'll just put in the comic wherever and whenever she wants. For example, at one point in the comic, suddenly the main characters are married and have kids, despite them just dating in the previous chapter. It's never explained that we jump forward in time at any point. They just suddenly have kids. Okay, besides the story and the writing, let's take a look at the art. Jesus criminy, where to start? I'm not here to pick on anyone's artistic skill, but I will say that this author was the same age as I am now when she started writing Sonichu, and it looks like it was drawn by a 3-year-old. Ignoring the quality of the art, clearly no planning went into it. Like I said before, you should start with a layout sketch before you even think about the finished page, but the author instead just wings it, leading to this hectic, cluttered, and chaotic mess. Sometimes the characters will even barely appear in panels so the author can fit in this ridiculous dialogue. Oh yeah, the dialogue. Like I said before, putting in too much dialogue all at once can make your comic incredibly unpleasant to read. This was the example I mentioned earlier. These walls of text are one of the things Sonichu is famous for. Oftentimes the characters in Sonichu will go on these huge tangents for no reason, and rather than spreading the dialogue over multiple speech bubbles and panels, the author just crams them all into one, sometimes even foregoing the rest of the comic and drawing the character in a blank void with a massive nonsensical speech bubble over their head. It's infuriating. There are a lot of things to be said about Sonichu, but I don't want to get into it here. If you want me to make a real critical analysis of the Sonichu comic, picking apart exactly what it does wrong from an objective standpoint, let me know because I would love to go into it. But anyway, back on topic, I hope this video helped you get an idea of where to start working on your comic. Just remember that it's never too late and it's never too early. If you got an idea for a comic you want to make, go for it. Nothing's stopping you. Just try not to make the next Sonichu and your comic will be amazing. Thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed already, be sure to do so, and remember to like the video and leave a comment while you're at it. I'll leave links to places where you can read or buy the comics I mentioned in the description below, including Sonichu. Also, check out Gun Kitty and Divine Acid. These are 2 comics by some of my art buds that inspired me and my comic a lot. Links to them are in the description as well. Also, special thanks to my patrons, Pikayuma, DK, Beans, Miss Jukebox 8, Nori Girl, Dreaded Cypher, and Michael P, who all got to see this video early. You can see the next one early too if you become a patron right now. You'll also get to see pages of my comic before they go up too, starting with the 2nd chapter. Also, don't forget to check out my new gaming channel, Taco Games, where I stream occasionally. Link in the description. Thanks for watching, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.